In the last section, we spoke about some of the different config that we put into our persistent volume claim. Now, at the end of last section, I had mentioned that there are some other possible options that we could put inside of here. We did not put these options in because we are going to rely upon the defaults for each of these. But there's one option in particular that I want to mention because it might be very important for you to use at some point in time in the future. Okay. So I want you to imagine kind of what happens behind the scenes when we hand that persistent volume claim off to Kubernetes. And so if we look back at the diagram over here, remember at some point in time, we hand that pod config off and Kubernetes sees, oh, they want that 500 gigabyte option. And so Kubernetes has to go and find either that pre-configured, pre-created ahead of time persistent volume or make one on the fly. So think about what's going on behind the scenes there. We're essentially saying to Kubernetes, hey, I need 1 gigabyte worth of storage. Can you get me something that meets these requirements? That's what the persistent volume claim is really doing. So Kubernetes gets that, and then we're going to imagine what exactly happens on your computer when you run this stuff. We can kind of imagine that Kubernetes probably says something like, all right, well, I'm on this developer's personal laptop, or maybe I'm on their personal desktop. Not a lot of storage options available here. Pretty much all I've got to put any information in is your hard drive. So on your computer, by default, Kubernetes is going to say, you know what, I'm going to make a slice of your hard drive that is 1 gigabyte large. And so we can imagine on your hard drive, we get this 1 gigabyte little piece of your hard drive that is going to be a persistent volume. And that persistent volume gets handed back over to your pod. So on your computer, when you ask Kubernetes for some amount of storage, there's really just one place for Kubernetes to allocate that storage. It's just your hard drive, and there's really not a lot of other options. Now you can actually see in the Kubernetes config where it decides to make this the default, where it decides to say, I'm just going to put it on your hard drive. To do so, you can flip on over to your terminal and run kubectl git storage class. So when you run get storage class, you're going to see all the different options on your computer that Kubernetes has for creating a persistent volume. Right now, we have a single option called standard. It is the default option. So if we do not specify a storage class with our persistent volume claim, the standard option will be used by default. And the provisioner, or essentially how Kubernetes is going to decide how to provision or create this persistent volume, is by using the minikube host path option. I want you to also do a kubectl describe storage class as well, and you'll see some more information about that option right there. So when you do so, it tells you in very broad terms, yes, we have a provisioner that is minikube host path. Minikube host path means exactly what we saw over here. Minikube host path means that when we ask Kubernetes to create this persistent volume, it's going to look on the host machine to Minikube, and it's going to make a little slice of space on your personal hard drive. All right, so at this point, this probably seems at least somewhat palatable. Yeah, Kubernetes needs some space. It's going to try to claim some space off of your computer or your personal hard drive. But things start to get way more complicated when we start to move our Kubernetes cluster from your computer into a cloud environment. So at some point in time, you and I are going to move our application over to a cloud provider. And when we are working with a cloud provider, we get a tremendous number of different options of where some hard drive space, or essentially file system space, can be sourced from. So in a cloud or production environment, if we say, hey, I need 1 gigabyte of storage to Kubernetes, Kubernetes is going to turn around and say, great, which one do you want? I got a billion options available. And so just about every cloud provider that you're going to work with is going to have some different solution for storing information. And you need to tell Kubernetes, unless you want to use the default option, which of these different options you want to use. So if you are hosting an application on Google Cloud, the Google Cloud service called persistent disk is going to be used to store information with your persistent volume. If you're on Microsoft Azure, you can either use Azure File or Azure Disk. If you're on AWS, you will use AWS Block Store. Now, there's many other options that are available in a cloud environment. You can see some of the other options at this address right here. I actually already opened up that page. So on that page, you'll see storage classes. And if you scroll down to provisioner, the provisioner is essentially what determines how the space that you're asking for gets created. And so these are all the different options that you have available. You can look at that list and decide on which one you want, but I can tell you that by default, most of the time, you're probably going to want whatever the default is for your particular cloud provider, which on, say, Google Cloud, it's going to be persistent disk. On AWS, it's going to be block store. Now, when you create your Kubernetes cluster on a cloud provider like Google Cloud or AWS, one of these services is going to be set up by default for you. So in other words, right now, inside of our local environment, we are setting up this persistent volume claim without designating a storage class name. And we did not designate that option because we are relying upon the default. And like I just said, the default for us is to create a little slice on our hard drive to use for this persistent volume. But when you push your application up to Kubernetes on Google Cloud or AWS, the standard option is not going to be Minikube host path. Instead, the standard option or the default option for use on AWS or Google Cloud will be automatically configured for you to be either Google Cloud Persistent Disk or AWS Block Store. So, long story short here, what I'm trying to tell you is that when you ask Kubernetes for some amount of storage on your local machine, it's just going to take a slice of your hard drive. When you are in a cloud environment, it's going to choose one of these default options for you unless you very specifically tell it to use something else. For most applications, I don't really want to make a broad claim here, but I'm going to tell you that if you've got a normal application that just has a traditional database like Postgres or MySQL, you're probably going to be okay using the default options, which are probably going to usually be Google Cloud Persistent Disk or AWS Block Store. But I just want you to know that this option is available and you can customize where Kubernetes is going to look to create this little file system to allocate to your pod. All right, so enough on all this. I think we've spoken about persistent volume claims enough. So we've now created our persistent volume claim, which is essentially advertising an option that can be used for storage by all the different pods in our application. So last thing we have to do in the next section, we're going to open up our Postgres deployment, and we're going to update the pod config in here and tell it that when this pod is created, it's going to need to look at all the different storage options that are available and advertised by this persistent volume claim and make sure that it says, oh yeah, I want this very specific volume claim that's going to give me a 2 GB storage option. So quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute.